hello, bonjour, ciao, hola, hello, shora, ni hao. Welcome to Hunrad.
Hey guys, what's going on? Chris here with Shugghead Gaming, and here's my review for Obduction for the PlayStation VR. A new sci-fi puzzle adventure game from Cayenne, the creators of Myst. You have been abducted far across the universe, and you find yourself on a broken alien landscape with odd pieces of Earth. Explore, uncover, solve, and find a way to make it home. Released originally on PC and console almost a year ago, this review is of the PSVR version, which released May 8th, 2018, for an estimated retail price of $33 American. As usual, guys, if you like this video, hit that like button, and if you want to see more PlayStation VR content from me, please consider subscribing. As always, let's talk graphics. Well, it's not a looker, that's for sure. The standard 2D version, even on the PS4 Pro, ran poorly, with frame rate staggers being very frequent. If the 2D version was having hiccups, then it shouldn't come as any surprise that the much delayed VR port was gonna suffer. How bad? Well, let's take a look. Two things are obvious right away when you load into the world. The first is that the developers have obviously tried to retain the texture-rich, colorful, and expansive nature of the core game. The second that slaps you across the face is that was a bad choice, as the whole world looks like it's covered in Vaseline. Everything beyond 5 feet from your view is a blurry mess, with texture detail not so much gone as it's just blurred out. Spaces inside and narrow paths do fare better with increased texture detail being noticeable, but when in open areas, which is a majority of the game, it's a shit show. When really looking out to far areas, the blurred scenes are compounded by jagged edges and an actual deterioration of the graphic models themselves, as buildings and trees start to look like hundreds of holes were shot through them. Pop-in is also very bad, with rocks, trees, and other objects popping into view literally feet away from you. All of the above is made even worse if you're teleporting quickly, or even worse yet, when riding the train car. Even with severe blinders on, the train car ride is an utter graphical disaster. This could also point to why the full locomotion wasn't offered at launch, as maybe the game on PSVR just simply can't really render the world when it's in movement and maintain an acceptable frame rate. If this is the case, which I believe it to be, a future full locomotion patch may be impossible for the PSVR. As I mentioned previously, the developers have obviously attempted to maintain the look of the original 2D version, and at times you can see hints of a nice game, especially when enclosed in spaces, as objects and water effects are almost nice looking. Lighting and shadow effects, while drastically reduced from the original game, are still present, and at times, the sunlight rippling through the tree leaves can almost be well done, if it wasn't for the blurred out mess of the trees and leaves. Credit where credit is due, though, as I applaud the developers on bringing the full game to PSVR and not a shadow of the original game or some mini-game version of the complete experience. I'm looking at you, Arc Park. For better or for worse, the whole world is present here with full draw distance attempted, complete with an animated skyline that doesn't look too bad. So the question must be asked, is this just too much for the PSVR to run? As a fairly wide open game with current gen graphics, I think the answer is yes. This is likely why this game was delayed, and why many other ports simply don't see the light of day. More successful ports of games with less taxing graphics, such as Skyrim on the PSVR, fared much better overall, with less taxing last-gen graphics actually coming off as stunningly better overall, and especially on the PS4 Pro. This is partially due to better optimization as well, with better handling of texture drop-off and overall resource allocation. The Solace project, a personal favorite of mine, also, comparatively, is a significantly better VR port of a current-gen game. While the Solace project is a more conservative open-world adventure game, this proves that less is more when creating adventure games of this style for the PSVR. It should be mentioned that the Solace project did receive a full motion and pro upgrade patch a few weeks into its initial release, so here's hoping Obduction can be saved as well. Sound is up next.
Greatly appreciate your help, but this'll be complicated.
Overall sound design is well done and appears to be a straight port. While this is a good thing for the overall sound package delivered, this also has meant very little usage of the PSVR's 3D audio capability. What that means for us, the PSVR crowd, is a much less immersive experience than what we are looking for. The overall sounds in the world are kept fairly minimal as to add to the feeling of desolation and loneliness. Often you'll just hear the wind blowing with a few other environmental or puzzle-based sounds coming in. What's here is good, but I honestly was expecting a lot more. I just never felt the overall soundscape pull me into the world. And with the graphics what they are, the game really needed to nail the sound side of things. Voice work by the oddly chosen visual choice of full motion video characters is delivered very well. Performances are solid across the board and serve as the main plot device for the game. Music is sparse but effective when used. While most of the time the music served to add tension or ambiance to the game, it was a little immersion breaking when I would notice the exact same trigger point for the music as I walked back and forth searching for puzzle clues. All in all, the sound doesn't really hurt the game, but it also doesn't help to elevate it either. And that brings us to gameplay. Yup, movement sucks. There really isn't any way around it. For those that have motion sickness issues with full locomotion in VR, then this won't hurt as much. But for the majority of us, this is an irritatingly all too common sin in VR games. What the game gives us for control is the option to use either the DS4 controller, a single move, or two move controllers to control your character in the game. Regardless of controller option you choose, movement is teleportation and click turning based. Click turning appears to be locked at 30 degrees and also cannot be adjusted. My preference is using two moves as it gave me two hands to grab things with, as well as two controllers to teleport with, which was very helpful when all too often I was stuck against an object with only one hand movable. While I find both click turning and teleportation to be massively immersion breaking, in this game it can also be very maddening. With the standard 2D version having full locomotion as the default control scheme, the world, unlike the dev's previous title Myst, is designed for that type of movement. Getting close to objects to interact with can be absolutely maddening, as I was often too close, too far, or turning at an odd angle in order to interact properly. It's doable, but requires way more work than it should be. In addition to the 2D version being full locomotion and smooth turning, the PC VR version also contains the same movement options, so the exclusion of this on the PSVR version stings even more. As mentioned before, I have my doubts that the PSVR version can even handle full locomotion, but even smooth turning would be a very welcomed option. Control tracking was pretty good while using two moves, but actually became very poor when using the DS4, as the tracking zone for which the controller could be moved and tracked was actually smaller, and it bottomed out more easily. Okay, with movement out of the way, what about the game? Well, it's a great game actually, and especially for those who enjoy puzzle-heavy games. While I actually prefer my puzzles sprinkled amongst more action-heavy moments, I was surprised to find myself caught up in this world, despite all the above issues. It wasn't the story which I found to be confusing and boring, but rather it was the exploration and intrigue of how every puzzle connected in the world. Once the game opened up to dimensional shifts and teleportation jumps, I found myself hooked, if not even more confused. You will spend the majority of your time exploring this desolate world while keeping track of what is out there, how it might be connected to other aspects of the world, what's in there, what code do you need, how do you get to certain spots. These are the questions that will keep you moving forward, even if you have no clue what you're doing and what's happening. Puzzle types range from memorization, logic puzzles, and conventional pull this lever and see what it does puzzles. Eventually, if you pull at enough strings, things start to unravel and you're on your way. I lack the patience often required for games in this genre, so frustration is usually the thing that causes me to delete games like this. However, only a few times did I find myself reaching for Google Assistance. Puzzles for the most part seemed fair and just hard enough to be thoughtful and not frustrating. The only real issue I had is actually a purely VR issue, as some puzzles require you to write down codes and clues. This, for obvious reasons, is a pain in VR, and it would be a nice addition in a future patch to add in a notebook that you could bring up in-game. Game length is 9 to 15 hours depending on how much you sightsee, and how smart you are. This can be played sitting or standing, with neither option having much motion sickness due to the control method implemented and the addition of the overly cautious comfort settings, specifically the vision blinders that come on when you're in the elevator or on a train car, which limit your viewing angle by at least 50%. This sucked, but nonetheless, motion sickness should be at a minimum. Just make sure you can put your arms out and to the sides for grabbing objects. And this brings us to fun factor and my final verdict. Bottom line, this is a good game with a very shitty port. Graphics are a mess, but honestly, I started to get used to them if I played long enough. Kinda like sitting in your own stink. Eventually, you can't smell it anymore. But every time I left and came back in, I was always taken back at how bad they were. Sounds are average and do the job, and the controls are maddening to the point of controller throwing. But the real reason to play is the adventure and puzzles themselves, and the devs have managed to maintain that aspect even in this poor port. So what's my verdict? Well, as you know, I hate number ratings, and I prefer to rate games on a basis of buy, wait for a sale, or burn it to the ground. I'm not a huge fan of puzzles, and even after trying this in the graphically and control superior 2D version, I still would only play this in VR, and probably not at all if I didn't have to review it. For puzzle fans, and you know who you are, this is still a wait for a sale because it's a mess in its current state. I would wait for a price drop and to see if patches follow. This could be as good as the devs could manage, so maybe a deep sale. All others just avoid this and go pick up the Solace project for cheap. Anyways, guys, that's it for me. If you like this video, hit that like button, and if you want to see more PSVR content from me, you know the deal, consider subscribing.